for tonight, we're looking into some questions on whether or not there's good positive evidence for thinking that God exists. And I think the answer to that question is yes. We're only going to be looking at one aspect of that tonight, and it's sometimes called the moral argument for the existence of God. This is the thing, and why I choose something like this, and I think the answer is because it's simply unavoidable. You know, people might look at the cosmological argument and think, you know, that's interesting to think about, but it not necessarily hit them in the thick of their experience. It's the same for the design argument for the existence of God. Even though Antony Flew, who was more or less the stalwart of atheism for about 50 years, came to believe that God exists because of the design argument for the existence of God. And what he said was, you know, I'd been saying for all of those years, you need to take your belief where the evidence leads you. He said, at the end of the day, there's more reasons for thinking God exists than not. And so he became a believer. It doesn't mean he became a Christian. It means he became a believer in the idea that God exists, and largely because of the fine-tuning features of the universe. Tonight, I just want to look at the moral argument and just unpack it a little bit for you, see if we can get our head around it. And in large part because, like I said, when you watch the news and you see that there are the atrocities that are happening in the world, you want to be able to say something like, this is more than something that's just in bad taste. You want to be able to say that the things that you see that are on the news that are morally wrong are objectively wrong. And here's what I mean by that. When you say that a value is objective, what that means is that these values exist independent of human minds and human constructions. Another way of saying it is, we're not making this stuff up. They would exist, in fact, if there are no human beings walking around. They are, so to speak, a part of the furniture of the universe. So let me unpack it a little bit in this way. There's an argument that goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now remember, objective just meaning independent of our minds and constructions. However, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. Or if you just want to tweak it a little bit, you could say this. It's more reasonable to think that God exists than God does not exist. Although consistent atheists have to avoid accepting both premises, because by the way, the form of the argument is correct, it's not hard to find atheists who endorse the premises. And this is what's pretty interesting to me. So what this means is that the argument can be defended by quoting exclusively from atheists. You don't actually have to quote Christians or Jews or Muslims. And after sketching a defense of the premises and dealing with the frequent confusion between what's called epistemology and ontology, here's the idea. Because this is what really got me. As I was going into the time of selecting a topic to write on my dissertation, when I was doing my doctorate, this is what I settled on. And the question was, you know, is God the best explanation for the moral foundations in our ethical deliberations? And ultimately what I argued was yes. And I had a pretty diverse committee there, one of which was an atheist. So as you can imagine, he probably thought I was wrong at the end of the day. So let me unpack this a little bit for you and see if this makes some sense. Now, traditionally, atheists have acknowledged that God is a necessary condition of objective moral values. And I just want to quote a couple for you. I'm not gonna pound you too hard, but I want you to get an idea here. Paul Kurtz, who is a self-described secularist, said this: the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundations. Let me be clear on what that means. What that means is you're talking about what it is that gives these values their existence, not whether or not you know who the source of those values are. That's the difference between ontology, being, and epistemology, what you believe or what you know. And this is where I think some people get confused. Because even with friends, you know, say, well, you know, I don't believe that God exists, but I'm a good moral person. That's not even what the question is. Some people would say, I'm an atheist and I'm a good moral person. That may be. It's not even what the question is. The question is, if atheism is true, then what is the source or the foundation of goodness? That's a different question. Now, see, traditionally, what Christians have grounded it in is in the very nature of God himself. And from that, when he creates, so to speak, it supervenes onto his creation. He infuses creation with goodness. So Paul Kurtz, when he says the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation. What's the source of it? If they're neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, he goes on to say, then they are purely ephemeral. How about Julian Baggini? He said, if there's no single moral authority, that is, if there's no God, we have to, in some sense, create values for ourselves. And that means that moral claims are not true or false. You may disagree with me, but you cannot say that I have made a factual error. Now, again, all I'm quoting here are atheists. Let me be clear. How about Richard Dawkins? He's probably the most famous atheist I'm going to quote tonight. He said this. He said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, that is, no God, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. And Dawkins goes on to concede. He said this, it's pretty hard to defend absolutist morals on grounds other than religious ones. Nevertheless, the same guy who says, since there is no God, because he's a pretty well-known atheist, he says there are no real, when you talk about moral values, they're not a part of the furniture of the universe. That's the quote that I was giving here. We observe, has the properties we would expect, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. Nevertheless, he comes up with 10 commandments that he's expecting people to take pretty seriously. He even had a series called Religion, the Root of All Evil. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because you just said it doesn't exist. Now, that's coming from his worldview, which of course he's coming from atheism. So I was just looking for some consistency there. If there is evil, what's the source of it? If there is good, what's the source of it? But if atheism is true, by your own admission, there is no source of it. They're just things that at the end of the day we find in bad taste. So by distinguishing between various different properties, or what we might call the moral law, when you look in philosophy, philosophers have put forward a variety of independent reasons to accept the premises of the argument that I was given before. And again, this is the part that I think is interesting. You don't even have to believe in God to accept it. There's more reasons to think these things are true than false, but it's also, when you say what's the ground of it, most would even concede God. So let me give you a few things to think about here. One is called the argument from moral prescription. So much like when you go to a doctor and they offer you a prescription for medicine and it's supposed to help you with some health issue, well, the same happens with morality. So beyond its objectivity, what is sometimes called the moral law is not really analogous to what you might call a scientific law. So when I trip up, falling is something I'm caused to do, not something that I'm obligated to do. It's just something I'm doing. The moral law, on the other hand, prescribes, but it doesn't cause actions that I'm obligated to do or even refrain from doing. So while I never fail to obey, like the law of gravity, for example, I often fail to do the right thing. I know some of you are saying that, going, man, isn't that true? A physical law describes what is the case and can be used to predict what will be the case, but it doesn't prescribe what ought to be the case. That's what a moral law does. So Francis Beckwith, somebody that I respect a lot, and Greg Kokel, they said this, a command. So when you think of moral obligations, those are generated from commands. And what they said was a command only makes sense when there are two minds involved, one giving the command and the one receiving it. For some of you, you might think back to your home and your parents, but you have minds that are involved there. And they go on to say, if an objective moral law has the property of being a command that we receive, then there must be an objective, personal, and moral commander, or communicator in this case, beyond individual or collective humanity. There's a philosopher named G.E.M. Anscombe, and affirmed concerning an objective moral law, said this, naturally, it's not possible to have such a conception unless you believe in God as a lawgiver. Like Jews or Stoics or Christians, you cannot be under a law unless it has been promulgated to you. That is, it's literally been given to you. Now, I want to be clear about this. There's nothing necessarily about the moral argument for the existence of God that gets you to the truth of Christianity. It gets you to the existence of God. The truth of Christianity really hinges on something completely different, and that's whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. So I just wanted to say that on the front end. But the idea that we have moral prescriptions means that there is somebody that is morally superior to us that is giving those to us, which also gets into the second point. It's not just that we believe that there are objective moral values like this is good or this is bad. We also believe that there are obligations, there are duties that we have. And so it's one thing to talk about the value of something. It's another thing to talk about the obligations and who actually generates obligations here. So an argument for moral obligation. Francis Beckwith, who I was quoting before, said this. He observes how, and I just quote him, our experience indicates that moral obligation is deeply connected to our obligations toward other persons. And that's kind of the word that you would have to underline, persons. I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, like an evolutionary process, for example, then I must be obligated by something personal. And since there are objective moral obligations that transcend finite persons, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are the most fundamentally obligated. There's a philosopher named H.P. Owen. You writing all these names down yet? There's a philosopher named H.P. Owen. He said, on the one hand, objective moral claims transcend every human person. On the other hand, we value the personal more highly than the impersonal, so that it is contradictory to assert that impersonal claims are entitled to the allegiance of our wills. Like there's just some impersonal force out there that all of a sudden my will has to bend to. He's saying, that doesn't really make any sense. The reason that we bend our will is we come under the authority of something when it's commanding us to do something. So the only solution, goes on to say, to this paradox is to suppose that the order of objective moral claims is in fact rooted in the personality of God himself. Richard Taylor, he even agrees that the idea of a moral obligation or duty is more important and binding than those imposed on us by, like, me to you and you to me. Here's why. When I command my children to do something, I'm not the source. I might give them a command to do something good and for their benefit. That's usually the only time I command them to do something. Do this. Usually I'm also commanding it because they're doing something else. So I'm trying to direct their behavior. But here's the thing. I'm not the source of the goodness there. I'm trying to direct them to goodness. It's not coming from me. It's not coming from you. It's also not coming from us just rubbing our heads together and saying, this seems like a good idea. In fact, Michael Ruse, who's down at Florida State, who's written pretty extensively on the idea of Christianity, and I've mentioned him in several talks before. Here's what he says. He said, when it comes down to morality, he said, if God doesn't exist, then what that means is that morality is really no different than the teeth in your head. You have them there for basically some sort of evolutionary advantage, but there's nothing objective to them at all. It's just for social benefit. Michael Shermer, the famous skeptic, would admit the same thing. I've commended this show to you before. If you go to Closer to Truth, Robert Kuhn, Kuhn, who, as he says, I got later in life and the God idea got very interesting to me. And so he's a neuroscientist. So he started writing down all of these questions that he had and going to the top scholars in the world to answer these questions. Some are Christian, some are not. Some are agnostic, some are atheists. And one of the things when he was interviewing Michael Shermer, he says, some people would think that the idea that objective moral values gives you good reasons for thinking God exists. And he goes, yeah, but if you think about it, we need to be kind because it's hard for society to flourish if we're not kind. I don't know that God has to exist to say something like that. But catch the point that he's making, because this is what is key here. What this means is that for purely functional reasons, we should do certain things and avoid other things. But here's what he's also saying. What that also means is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong to the things that we do. It's just functionally wrong. It's a little disruptive, right? So when a woman is raped, there's nothing intrinsically wrong to it, but it is disruptive. And we don't need things to be disruptive. Or when someone is murdered, it might throw a community into chaos, but there's nothing intrinsically wrong to it or objectively wrong to it. It's just disruptive. It's purely about function. But here's the thing, and Paul Copan says this. Paul Copan says, surely on the face of it, it is more reasonable to believe that rape is intrinsically wrong and that murder is intrinsically wrong than to say that it is purely, functionally speaking, disruptive. All of that would give you reasons for thinking, in the most practical sense of the term, that God exists. So as we go on, we appear to apprehend and to measure ourselves against a moral standard. But it's hard to conceive of this ideal as just like an abstract reality. Let me quote this. It's clear what is meant when it is said that a person is just, but it's bewildering when it is said that in the absence of any people, justice exists. What would that even mean? Moral values seem to exist as properties of persons, not just abstract ideas. And this is why A.E. Taylor said this: were there no will in existence except the wills of human beings who are so often ignorant of the law of right and so often defy it, it's not apparent what the validity of the law could even mean. Recognition of the validity of the law thus seems to carry with it a reference to an intelligence which has not, like our own, to make acquaintance with it like piecemeal, slowly, and with difficulty, but has always been in full and clear possession of it, and a will which does not, like our own, often set it at naught, which is just basically like a British way of saying kind of cast it aside, but is guided by it in all of its operations. And you go, who could that possibly be? And the answer is, well, there's one good candidate here, right? And that would be God. So, while I could say a lot more, there's one last thing that I want to point out tonight, and then I want to get to your questions in case that you're submitting those to Minty. Hopefully you are. But here's the thing. I want to make the point to say that objective moral values do actually exist. When you look back at Nazi Germany, right? And you find out that there are those kinds you don't even have to go that far back. You do realize that when there are crimes against humanity that are happening even right now, you have the international, you have people that are crying out internationally to say, somebody needs to intervene and to stop this. When you look at what was happening, not just the eugenics that was happening in Nazi Germany, and not just literally the eradication of Jews and Catholics and so forth, when you look at all of the moral atrocities that were happening, here's something that I found very interesting. When they would go back and they would interview SS officers, or they would go back and they would interview people that were in high positions of command in World War II, the Germans, and they would say, why in the world did you do what you did? When you think of like a Joseph Mengele, who was literally taking the bones of Jewish children and breaking them so that he could study the healing effects of things. Why would you do something like that? And it was so interesting to watch their response, because over and over again, you would hear these soldiers say, because I had a duty. And I'm sitting there going, you had a duty to what? To whom did you have a duty? You might have had a military duty, but that doesn't mean you had a moral duty. And this is where you have people that stand up under objective moral principles and say, I'm not going there. This is why, for example, the Confessing Church, which was one of the few churches in Germany at that time, they would stand up against Hitler. One of the most famous people that was part of that, you've probably heard of, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was also a part of an effort to assassinate Hitler. This guy has to go. Why is that? Is because the things that he was commissioning are so morally abhorrent and against what anything God would have done in his creation. It has to be stopped. It has to be stopped. All of that basically to say, we have good positive reasons for thinking objective moral values do exist. And that, by the way, when the United States actually got involved in the war, there were good moral reasons to do it. But you don't want to say, well, they have their own morality in Germany, and we kind of got ours here, and at the end of the day, might makes right. Might doesn't make right. And here's why. Suppose we didn't win the war. Suppose that the Germans did. It would not make, when they had the commissioned rape of women, when they had the commissioned murder of innocent people, it wouldn't have made it right simply because they won. Might doesn't make right. So, a couple of things to think about. When I talked about religious experiences, I talked about Richard Swinburne, and he has what's called the principle of credulity. This is basically the idea that unless I have good positive reasons to question what's given in my experience, I should take my experience as a good guide to reality. right? So I'm seeing all of you right now. And you know what? I'm not hyped up on coffee right now. So there's no reason to think that I have a drug-induced state. You're actually all out there. But there's an atheist named Peter Cave. And Peter Cave argues that, and I just quote him, "Whatever skeptical arguments may be brought against our belief that killing the innocent is morally wrong, we are more certain that the killing is morally wrong than that the argument is sound. Torturing an innocent child for sheer fun of it is morally wrong, full stop." And this, by the way, again, is coming from an atheist. So when I was looking into the issue of ethics and friends of mine that don't believe in God, and I'm looking at them and saying, but you know, they're pretty darn good people. It really kind of threw me up a little bit. I was like, how can that be? But after reflecting on it a little bit, I thought, well, here's the key difference. If God doesn't exist, I agree with Richard Dawkins. At its core, good doesn't exist either, and evil doesn't exist either. They're just things that are happening. But certainly we want to look at some things and say, no, this is evil. Or when you see charity, kindness, you see altruism, you want to say, that's good. We're not getting at whether or not you believe in God. We're getting at what's the foundation of those values. Here's another way to say it. And by the way, there's some limits to this analogy, all right? And I know that. So here's the idea. If you go to mow your yard and you pull your lawnmower out, you may not know who it is that created the lawnmower, but it doesn't mean any less that you're using it. You may not know the source of the lawnmower, but you're still pushing it and mowing your yard. One of these is about the ontological foundations of what we're talking about. And the other of these has to do with your beliefs. So it's like working on borrowed capital. Does that make sense? That if God exists, then objective moral values do exist, whether or not you even believe in him or not. They're a part of the furniture and the foundation of the world that we inhabit. I think that's a good place to stop. There's certainly more that we could talk about, but I'm going to bring the chairs over here. Maybe we have some questions, and we'll get to them. Let me just move this out of the way real quick.
All right, I'm going to let them do the heavy lifting, because even though I look very strong, and I'm much stronger than I look, I'm going to let them do that. All right, so if you head on over to menti.com and put in our code 68743, you can jump in and join the conversation.
Thanks, Alex.
Please go ahead and vote questions that you really want Jeremy to answer, as well as please send hard questions, y'all. You get an extra prize of
Why do you say that every week?
If you can stump him, if he doesn't know the answer.
There are plenty of things I don't know the answer to.
I haven't found one yet.
All right, so what are the other questions that we have?
All right. Okay, first question. You ready?
I think so.
Okay. Are there other sources other than the Bible that are considered reliable sources of morality or moral guidance?
Are there other sources other than the Bible? Well, since I believe that all truth is God's truth, whether it's coming from a Christian or not, I think that there are things, I mean, if you think about it, I agree with Muslims that God exists. I disagree with Muslims on who God is. I agree with Jews that, well, not secular Jews, they don't believe God exists. But I agree with theistic Jews. They believe that God exists. We disagree on who God is. If you look, for example, in what a Jew would call the Hebrew Bible, we refer to as the Old Testament. Obviously, we have a moral foundation that's largely in agreement with them, right? That's obviously a part of our text. But even if you look, for example, in the Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants, which are two of the four sources of spiritual authority for Mormons, there are certain moral principles that we agree on. For example, the intrinsic dignity and value of human persons, which is why I agree with Mormons on this. To say that, I gave the abortion talk several weeks ago, and to say, look, if this child has an intrinsic dignity and intrinsic value, then we need to take that seriously with our moral deliberations as to the rights that this child possesses. So notice that that's not a non-Christian source, but we agree on certain moral principles. Here's the other thing. Did you notice how many atheists I was quoting tonight? All you would have to do is to go to their sources. I mean, maybe not Richard Dawkins, because he was like, hey, good and evil don't exist, and then he calls Christianity evil. I'm like, nope, can't do that, right? Not at least be consistent. But if you think of all the others, all of the others were agreeing with me, even though, by the way, we fundamentally disagree on whether or not God even exists. So, yeah, I think that you can go to non-biblical sources and find that we are in agreement on a lot of moral issues where Where we have to focus on is what I was talking about tonight. Okay, that's fine, but then what is it that's the source of those things? Here's the thing that I asked. So I in a conversation with an atheist friend of mine up in Raleigh. I said, here's the question that I have fundamentally for you. We were sitting in a coffee shop, right? Here's it. If the universe began as a valueless process, which it did, it was just an event, then at what point did these moral values just arrive? When was that? There's no God there to put them into creation. You have a mindless and valueless process at the Big Bang. Where did moral values come in? What is that line of demarcation there? When is it? And we're still waiting for a pretty good answer to that question. Anything that's picked, by the way, is going to be completely arbitrary. Any place is going to be completely arbitrary. So it's a fair question to ask. I think it's something worth putting in there.
Okay, so you brought up the Nazis. I was waiting for the Nazis to come into this discussion.
Yeah.
And they did.
Yeah.
I was so relieved.
Hey, y'all know I like World War II, so.
Yes. So this question kind of goes along with the question that I have. The question is the moral standard something that we know internally or learn from an external resource? What about the people who don't believe in things like murdering the innocent, promiscuity, etc., are wrong? And I do feel like there's a little bit of muddied waters in our modern culture. I feel like objective morality was a lot clearer back in like the World War II era. And I feel like we've kind of moved into this time where, you know, we're debating even the grounds of objective morality.
Right.
So how do we navigate those waters?
Right, yeah. Well, here's the thing. I start with places that are so obvious to people's moral intuitions. Do I think that the source is internal to us? I think the answer to that is yes. I think you can look at the first 3 chapters of Romans and find that God has put his moral law into our hearts, and there are some things that we can't not know. And what that means is that since it comes with the package, so to speak, then we have these experiences that we have the ability to make moral judgments about them pretty much immediately, right? That being said, Paul does say that we do suppress the truth, and what happens is that it ends up having an effect on us as we suppress the truth. So Paul does go down that road. That being said, it doesn't mean that we can't be informed by something outside of what we're just talking about in Romans 1, 2, and 3. You have moral sources of authority all around you. I mean, when you think about your parents, or you get the idea. These are people that are supposed to be speaking some moral and ethical truth into our life. Here's the thing. All I have to do to show that objective moral values exist is to get somebody to agree with me on one of them. Not every one of them. That's it. If there is any one thing that is objectively morally wrong, that's all I have to show. So I typically will talk about 2 major things: murder or rape. That's it. And if I can get somebody to agree with me, look, that is not just bad taste. That's not just against a cultural appropriation. That is intrinsically morally wrong. Then at that moment, I've gotten them to agree with me. So I try to start with areas that are a lot clearer and then to work my way out from areas that are really clear to say, yeah, we do have some things we need to talk about, because there are some areas, morally speaking, that are a little bit trickier waters to navigate. But again, I want to be clear. All I have to do is to find one thing. And when they agree with me, I'm like, all right, so there we are. Objective moral values do exist. So when I have a person that says something like, truth is relative, usually all I have to say is rape intrinsically morally wrong? Or is rape objectively morally wrong? And if they say yes, their relativism, they got over it pretty quickly. Or is murder intrinsically or objectively morally wrong? If they say yes, they got over their relativism pretty quickly, and they joined the team. Again, I just start from the place where it's clear, and then I'm gonna work my way out. Some of the things that we're struggling with now are because of like advancements in technology. And as technology advances, and I don't just mean like with pornography and stuff like that. I mean, even when you talk about engineering and some of the ethical, in medicine, some of the conundrums that it puts us in. Yeah, I get it. There are definitely some gray areas. But what that doesn't mean is because there are gray areas that objective moral values don't exist. It doesn't mean that either. It just means this one's tougher to judge than some other things that are obviously more clear.
All right, so speaking of gray areas, the next question is, how can we defend the legislation of morality by the state? The atheist would say that we should not legislate morality, but how else can the government defend the safety and well-being of its citizens?
Well, first, I don't know that an atheist would say that we don't legislate morality. Again, this is more a question of what is the source of the values that we're using here. And at least in law, I'm not going to go on this road too much, but there's a question between what's called natural law, which is usually connected to the belief that God exists and he puts his law into creation itself, versus what is called logical positivism, or not logical positivism, it's called positivism with law, and there may be a disconnection between what we talk about in morality or ethics and the law itself. That's a conversation for another time, right? But no, I don't see atheists saying that legislators shouldn't craft laws. And so, but again, the difference is going to be probably grounded in something like what Michael Shermer is talking about when he's in Closer to Truth, or in some of the books that he's written. If I remember right, the name of his book is The Moral Arc. But again, the idea here is we have to do some things to act, because when you do see rape and you do see murder and you see other things, then we have to draw this behavior in. And now again, it's different than saying it's objectively wrong than to say functionally we just can't go on like that. Which is why I gave the example of Michael Ruse saying, ethics has basically arrived, purely evolutionarily speaking, like the teeth in your head. It's just adaptive. That's all that it is. I would just prefer to say, no, there's a lot more to it than just saying it's preferential. So on the one hand, I'm disagreeing with the question. On the other hand, I'm agreeing that how you legislate, if it's not connected to morality, might be a little tricky.
All right, this kind of piggybacks off of that a little bit. The question is, does morality change with culture? In other words, things like homosexuality and abortion at one time were socially immoral, and now they are a gray area in our culture. So are they moral? Does that change? How do we handle that?
Not if a value is objective, it doesn't change. That's the point. Now, I want to be clear on something here. Some values are absolute and some are objective, and there is a difference there. When you say that something is absolutely wrong, what that means is with regard to all people at all times in all places, period. If you look, however, in the Bible, there are some commands that God gives to specific people at specific times, at specific places. That's objective. Those people aren't sitting there making up these values. God gives Abraham certain commands that he doesn't give other people. That's right. Was Abraham morally obligated to do it? And the answer is, God was talking to him, and so the answer is yes. Does that mean that because he commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, that I therefore have the command to go sacrifice my 4 children? And the answer is no. And by the way, Isaac wasn't sacrificed, right? But I'm just trying to make a point here, right? The answer is no. It was still objective, it just wasn't absolute. I also want to be clear, simply because something is gray, all we're saying there is that it's a little bit more difficult to discern. That doesn't mean that there's not a fact of the matter, morally speaking. It's just a little bit more difficult to discern. So a good guiding rule for me, I said this in the abortion discussion, I'll bring it up again here because we are talking about ethics. Where there is a gray area, a guiding rule that I go by is, when I'm sitting there going, I am not quite sure what to do here, I always go to, what is erring on the side of caution? I'm just going to err on the side of caution. Because I will agree, there are certain times where you go, I'm not quite sure how to think about a situation.
That's very helpful. All right, so you mentioned Abraham in the Old Testament, and this one goes right along with it.
Okay.
So what about in the Old Testament where God tells his people to kill others, even children? Does that mean that God went against his own moral standard?
Okay, God can't go against his own moral standard. So there are a number of things here. One, by the way, this is a topic that's been brought up for me to address on a night. So, and it's not going to be a night, because I've had so many questions come in with specific passages in the Old Testament that I was like, all right, we're just going to have to jump into the Old Testament, I think. But let me speak to it briefly. So when you look at the Canaanites, for example, this is the group that's the most often brought up in the Old Testament. First, the passage pertaining to the Canaanites can be a little bit difficult to translate if you look at the Hebrew. So some would say it says to wipe them out, men, women, children, and so forth, right? That's a possible interpretation. There's another possible interpretation of the Hebrew, which is drive them out. So here's the idea. You have God's people. The land is inhabited by people that aren't supposed to have it. As they're coming back in, they're functioning under a promise that one day God will give it to them. Now, here's the thing. It's not going to happen that when, the Israelites are coming back home and you have the Canaanites that are there, they're going to sit there and go, well, they're back, so I guess we have to give their land back. It wasn't going to happen like that. There was going to be war. Here's what's debated, right? So when it says children, are we talking about, everybody has this image of children that are about yay big, right? You're just kind of swinging them in the arms and so forth. Even the idea of how old these kids are is somewhat debated. It's like Elisha and the bears, right? So when it describes the children are mocking Elisha because he's bald. All right, I'm totally with them on this. So, they're mocking Elisha because he's bald. He calls a she-bear out of the woods and mauls these kids. In the Septuagint, but you're like, that dude's hardcore, right? But here's the thing. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek rendering of the Old Testament, you're talking about young adults. You're not talking about like infants. It's even debated there. And you sit there and go, okay, how about women? Why would you assume that the women were innocent? I mean, why wouldn't you just look into it and say, by the way, these women hated the Israelites as well? And if they're a combatant and they're a part of the war, I'm just saying it's debated. And you need to be fair to what's going on and consider all of the information that is there. So while I'm going to give a lot of attention to this question a little bit later on, I think that's a good place to start. Can God violate his own moral law? The answer is no. Here's also another question. Does God owe me or anybody another day of life? And the answer is, he doesn't owe me anything. Not a thing. So, when you talk about God and say God's violating his own moral standard, I'm like, well, hold on. One, in principle, that's not possible because there's no one to command God or to obligate God to anything. There's no one higher than God. But also, if you start with what is in the received text, and you say, well, what is God at his core in terms of who he is? God is love. Now, God's a lot of it. God is just. God's a number of other. He's omniscient, omnipotent, and all those other things. But here's the thing. He's also not going to make a command that's a mistake either. So even if we're sitting there trying to pull out and say, why is God commanding this? It's not going to be in disjunction or dissociated with his essentially good character. The Canaanites, by the way, I just want to throw this out there because I'm going to stop with this because I'm going to give a whole night to this. They were not good people. They were not good people. And just like when you have people call on the United States when genocide breaks out somewhere in the world, it's always our phone that rings, by the way. The United States needs to do something here. Why do we need to do something here? And the answer is usually because what's happening over here is wrong and it needs to stop. You need to understand the Canaanites, the Assyrians were masters at torture and torment. And the main thing that they were interested in is expanding their own domain, usually by whatever means was necessary to do it. So again, thumbnail sketch, but I want you to have all the information in because this is the thing. People make moral judgments, and I'm like, you might want to hold off until you have the facts. Get the facts, and it will probably inform your judgment a little bit better. So I'll give you more facts a little bit later on. Is that at least a good start to the answer to the question?
That's good. I want to come back for that one.
Hey, we got some passages in the Old Testament. You'll sit there and go, what in the world? Why is God commanding, for example, a woman to marry her rapist in Deuteronomy? Y'all asked it, so I'm going to answer it, just not tonight.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but maybe we'll slide one more question in.
All right, y'all want to do one more?
With that? One more?
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, there's two that are similar, so we'll kind of lump them together.
Okay.
One question is, I have an atheist family member who used to be a practicing Christian who now believes that the universe and people in general are just good, no source needed. What do I say when they think that they are enlightened? And the other question that is similar is, what's the best response when I'm talking to someone who says, I'm morally good and that's enough, but isn't a Christian?
Okay, so let's start with the first one. So you have a person that was a Christian and now they're an atheist, but they say that they're basically a good person. They're using a value judgment pertaining to themselves, namely they describe themselves as good. I think the fair question is and by what objective standard are you measuring your goodness? So if there isn't an objective standard that you're measuring it by, then it's purely subjective. And this is what makes it even a little creepier. What that means is that on Tuesday, you can murder somebody because you say it's good for me. But on Thursday, have a change of mind and say, you know what, murder, I'm not going to do that anymore. The only thing that has happened there is that you have changed. It doesn't mean that you've changed for the better. It just means you've changed. If values are purely subjective. I've given this example before, but Ted Bundy best represented this when on a video recording, he was talking to a woman that he was about to attack and about to rape. It was found in his car. And one of the things that he said, I discovered for myself what apparently the Chief Justice of the United States of America hasn't discovered. And it's that if you multiply 1 million value judgments by 0, it doesn't make them one whit more rational. And here's basically what he was saying. Until I say something is moral or immoral, it has no value at all. He said, so what's the difference? Why is your life more valuable to you than a hog's life is to a hog? And if you fast forward onto the recording, this is the part that makes you creep out a little bit. He says, here's the thing. There isn't a bit of difference in the pleasure that I take in eating a piece of ham and the pleasure that I take in raping and murdering you. And then it goes off. Now, here's the thing. If we're purely creating values, he's right. If we're purely creating them. However, if these values are objective, one, where do they come from? But for a person to say, well, I'm a good person, by what measure are you judging that? Go to the second question, right? So you say, well, I'm good enough. Here's the thing. You can participate in all kinds of goodness and have no relationship with God whatsoever. If you go back to the Protestant reformers, they would make a distinction, in what they would call common grace. And this is the idea that since God has put his moral law into the universe and we can understand it, that means we can also participate in it. That's common to everyone, whether or not they believe in God or not. But it's totally different to say, I have a personal relationship with God, right? So I would want to go there. So when a person says that they're good enough, I'm like, and how did you judge that? How did you judge that? That would be one thing. And to get to the fundamental question, which is, and do you have a personal relationship with God? That I think is a different question. The Pharisees, which Jesus tends to rebuke them a time or two in the New Testament. They really didn't like him, did they? Here's the thing. He never denies that there are moments where they do good things, right? There are times where he recognizes some of the good that he does. What he despises is their heart. Here's another way of looking at it. I could tell my daughter to go and do something. One of my 4 girls, I could tell them to go clean your room, and they go and clean their room. Did they do a good thing? At least on the level that they did that, the answer is yes. But I want you to imagine them up in their room, and as they're cleaning their room, they're sitting there despising me in their heart. What's missing there? And the answer is the kind of connection that comes in love and the kind of motivation that comes in love to follow what it is that I'm asking them to do. So simply saying that I do good things says nothing about the heart that is behind the good thing. Does that make sense? And even Paul in 1 Corinthians, he says we have to make a distinction here in the kinds of goods. There's good that is like wood, hay, and stubble, and there is good that is like gold and silver. And when put up to the refiner's fire, those works that are quote unquote good, done purely for ourselves, it burns up because it proved to be absolutely useless, because the only good that stands at the end of the day is good in God. And that's what is, when it's put up to the heat of judgment, like our work is put up to the heat of judgment, what happens with gold and silver? It just purifies the good that was done. I think that's an important difference that I would want to pull apart. hopefully it answers the question. Is that a good place to stop?
I think that's great. I think that's a great challenge for us to leave on is what kind of good are you doing and what's the heart behind it? So we'll end there. Thank you so much.
Do we have more questions?
We do. We have, we have about 4 more. So
4? All right. All right, so later in the week, Melody and I will sit down together and we'll take a look at these questions. Pay attention to social media because we're going to pop it out there and hopefully you find it helpful. And then what we'll also do is before we kick off next Sunday night, before we start, you'll see it up on the screens and you're welcome to watch it then.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for coming, for participating, and for submitting such great questions.
Indeed, good questions.
If you want to support our coffee, feel free to drop some cash in the box on the way out, and we will see you all next week.
Have a great week. Thanks for coming.
Guys.